Question 1. Explain in detail how your project connects to at least 2 evolution academic disciplines. How did you go more in depth in those disciplines, not superficial engagement? Well, my 2 disciplines were English and history. In English, I mostly focused on the magazine aspect of my project. The magazine aspect was very much involved with writing many articles, and those articles included sexual science, the nightclub scenes, and homosexuality. I found this to be really helpful. I even met with Mr. Hennis. He really helped me realize my path and how I wanted to go through with this magazine, and it was more difficult than I expected it to be. I found a lot of times I kind of got writer's block on what to write, but whenever I went back to my research, I was really able to really move forward with English, and I think that was really helpful. With history, well, my project was based off of the 1918 to 1933 era in Germany, Berlin, and that was my really history aspect, was going into a lot of my research and seeing how our times were different back then versus now where we are. I thought it was really interesting going so in depth into this because it felt like I really understood it, and Miss Liao was so helpful with keeping me on track with research and making sure all my sources were reliable sources. Question 2. Explain in detail your experiential component of capstone. Identify the experience, how you went about arranging it, and what you learned for it. How to learn in the community. Well, my experiential component of my capstone was going to a museum. Unfortunately, this museum wasn't in the area, and I would have liked it to be, but it wasn't. Though unfortunately, I was in Chicago at the time, and I was able to go into the city and see a museum, the Art Institute of Chicago. I went to many exhibits there, and the exhibit I'd researched before to see if there were any special exhibits there, and there was a photography exhibit focusing on the photographer August Sanders and his photographs of the people during the Weimar Republic, people in Berlin, people outside of Berlin, and I thought it was so interesting. I found it so, and I was able to take some of what I saw from that exhibit and bring it into my project, and it kind of made me explore new themes of what I was really interested in learning. Question 3. Reflect on your level of independence in this project. What did you need support with? What were you able to tackle on your own? In what ways have you become more independent since the midstone? I believe throughout this project I was very independent. I remember in my midstones I was so worried because I was scared that I was not going to be able to do, 1, a project without any partners, and 2, that I would be kind of alone in my process and figuring out what I needed to research and going into kind of a different type of learning than I was used to. And even though we'd been working on that throughout the beginning of the year, it was so new for me and I was really scared. And that really changed after I finished my midstone, and I was remembered being so excited for capstone because I felt that I learned so much from my midstone. I believe my difference between this and capstone was really my independence and how I was able to kind of space out my work, and how I was able to really think through everything, and how I was okay, Lily, edit that part out. Okay. One thing I really needed help with was mental check-ins. because I believe that during my capstone I was going through a lot mentally, and I remember being so worried about it not coming together, and I remember being terrified about that. But having a lot of mental check-ins with Miss Liao and her asking me how I was and where I was at with the project was so helpful. Also, I remember how even though I was even independent, how I needed help with when I wanted to start not fully change my subject, though I wanted to change how I would present my project and how that would look. And that was really helpful with Miss Liao being there to help me through that process. Question 4. Walk us through all the steps of your design process, beginning with brainstorming and ending with this ExCom. What parts of your process worked well and helped you achieve your project goals? What part of your process do you continue to struggle with, and why? I started with brainstorming my project even before we officially began brainstorming and researching our capstone. My initial idea was to create a room and to people be able to enter it and see kind of an experience of what the nightclub was back in the 1930s in Berlin. I really had a change of heart in my capstone idea when I went to this museum and going to August Sanders, but I didn't realize it until I was writing up our essay on what we had researched so far in our capstone. And that's when I really had a change of heart, and I realized I don't want to do the room anymore, and I really want to kind of put a bit more focus on English and making a magazine, also photography. I really wanted to try and recreate photos and kind of give more visual aspect to what it looked like, even though the room would have. I felt that the photography, the magazine, would have given so much more information than I could have given in a room. I started that. Then after that, I started with making sketches of what I wanted each to look like. My first sketch was showing a little square magazine and having this woman's face on it, and the title was Taboo, which I wasn't sure that I wanted my name to be that, but eventually it did turn out to be Taboo. I also wrote ideas of little articles I could write, and some of them made it and some of them didn't. I brainstormed 3 that I really liked, and then some extras that I could put in just in case. During that, I remember talking with Miss Liao, and she told me that I should meet with Mr. Hennis on the magazine aspect because I seemed to have a very good grasp of what I wanted to do with my collage and my photography and recreating pictures. When I met with Mr. Hennis, he got very specific about how I needed to write my magazine, what my topics were going to look like, and how it should be spaced out. And he also gave me advice of what some resources I should look at, including watching a couple episodes of a TV show called Transparent, which really helped especially visualize what this time looked like, and I thought that was very helpful. Then, after I met with Mr. Hennis, that is when I started making prototypes. I started initially with my collage. I started on a big black board and I started pasting each different photos and see how they would look, and I rearranged them and rearranged until I found an order I really liked. And then from those photos I chose which ones I want to recreate. I initially had 5 or 6, and I put it down to about 4 photos that I recreated. And I kind of highlighted those photos and made them more present in the whole collage. I also started with working with a website called Lucid Press, which would help me design a magazine and help it look professional for the first part. Also give me a really good idea of spacing out and make it look as if this could have been a real magazine. And as I was looking at those two products, I realized even though those products were very, very visual, I wanted to go a further step. So I decided to make a screen, not make a screen, but I decided to make an outline for a screen, almost what I did for my Midstone project, and incorporate that into my project as showing archival footage that I found through my research and show it to the audience who would see during the expo night. I dealt with a lot of writer's block when I worked on the magazine. I found it very, very frustrating to start writing because I didn't know where to start and I didn't know how I would get all this information down in my magazine. And I realized that before I had started with this magazine that I had been writing for my little essay that we had before we started our brainstorming and before we started our making other projects. Okay, cut that. Before we started making our prototypes and before we started designing everything. So I eventually started with some of the topic sentences I used in my essay, and that really helped get me going on that. When I after I finished all of my aspects of my project and I went to Expo Night, I was so much less worried than I was when I went into my Midstone, because I felt like I had so much more information and I felt so much more confident about speaking to the public and speaking to people about my project because I felt like I really know my information. And I thought and for me, that was a really big deal because even though I do a lot of theater and I talk a lot in public, I feel very uncomfortable talking to people as myself in public. And I thought it was just so great to be able to get kind of all this information out and get it out in a great way. And I think my presentation looked great and I'm so happy with how it turned out. Question 5. Now that you are finished, which resource did you find the most helpful to you in doing your capstone and why? The most helpful I found was an interview, a radio interview that was written up and put on NPR's website. And it was an interview with Robert Beachy, the writer of Gay Berlin, and he was talking to an interviewer there, and he wrote out all the information that he had, and it was such an interesting talk that they had. I thought it was so helpful in really researching my project because it not only showed the certain aspects I knew already, as in I knew how open people were in their sexuality and I knew the nightclubs were very, very crazy and wild and loud. I learned so many new things. I learned about sexual science, which was a huge topic for me that I researched. I also learned about transvestite passes, which were these different passes that people had if they were medically allowed to be transvestites, and they would carry them around to prove to people that they were allowed to be dressed. If they were men who transitioned to being women, they would be allowed to wear women's clothing in public. The whole interview is very, very interesting, and I would recommend that other people would listen to it or read the interview. Question 6. Reflect on an aha moment you had during the project. What helped create that moment for you? The aha moment I had, I've mentioned before in this, I had a really big aha moment with realizing that I wanted my project not to be a room, but to be a magazine and a collage with pictures I had recreated. The whole moment was sparked by my visiting a museum and seeing August Sander's photography and his way of capturing different people during that time, and I thought it was so interesting. And really, I think what really helped it get to the front of my head that this is what I wanted to do was during when I was writing an essay for Evolutions, and I realized I don't really want to make a room. I want to more design something that you could probably more see in kind of like a museum setting. So I decided to create this magazine that would have all these different subjects that people could read about, and I also created the collage with my different artworks and a little, what I call the TV screen that shows archival footage of the 1918 to 1933. Question 7. What core content do you want people who saw your project to walk away with? In quotes, wow, I just learned blank about insert topic. What I would like them to say is, wow, I just learned that times were very progressive, more than any other place in the world, in Berlin during the 1920s to 1933. I would like them to say that because I think it really was a time like no other. I believe that it was so special in the time that it happened, because there was no other time like this until the 70s in Europe and America. But 1920s, 1918, that is so early for people to be so progressive. And when people came up to me during the expo, I got a lot of people who were very surprised about the different kind of progressiveness that people had, and how people were so open about who they were and they weren't afraid to be who they really wanted to be. And I found that to be so interesting to learn. Question 8. Reflect on your presentation, how your presentation went during the Capstone Expo. How have you grown your ability to do that skill? Again, I mentioned this before, but I was so proud of how I did during the Capstone Expo. I think that I've gotten so much better at public speaking this year, because before I had a lot of troubles with public speaking, and I know that's very strange because I have done theater basically almost my entire life, and I just always been scared of speaking in front of a classroom or speaking to other people about subjects that I know, or just being myself in front of other people. And I think really throughout this whole year I was able to so much improve on that skill, and I've become so much more outspoken just in class, and I've become more comfortable with public speaking, and I'm so happy that I've been able to cross that line of really overcoming that, and I really believe this project of my capstone really helped that. Question 9. How have your experiences from earlier units, trips, and/or projects in this year help shape your capstone project/process? I think what really helped shape my capstone project/process from earlier this year was me deciding that I could be a leader. Ever since I can remember, I've always been a follower, and I've always been someone who follows what the quote leader would do. And I've always been someone I've never been the outspoken person. I've never been the person who said we should do this and not that. I've always been the person who just goes along with whatever the other person says. I think this year I've changed so much, and I remember reflecting once on a project that I'd so much improved on that skill of being a leader, and I think during this project that helped so much, because I was able to lead through my project and I didn't have to ask. I mean, at some points, of course, I had to ask people, can I do this? Would I be able to do that? And I found that this year I was really able to push myself to be a leader. Question 10. What is something that from this capstone that you want to carry with you as you return to, quote, traditional school next year? Why? Next year, I want to continue to explore subjects that I am interested in, because I remember learning about the Weimar Republic in less than a day in history class last year, and I was so interested in that subject, and I was so disappointed that we weren't able to go in it more. And this year I was able to, and I was able to see all the different things I could have been able to learn last year that I was able to learn this year. And next year I really want to try and focus on not just learning the material and taking it in and then putting that all down on a paper and then moving on. I really want to explore topics that I'm interested in and find passionate in.